I think most of us fellas, when we get laid off, just paying the insurance wipes us out.
That's right.
That's $80 a month.
What is it cost to the national health insurance?
Well, it wouldn't cost any more money than what we're now paying on health. The difference is that you'd funnel it through a national health insurance program instead of letting the individual family pay that cost when they get hit. I know one woman that paid $39,000 in medical bills when her husband died from cancer. That was what that terminal illness cost her. Now, she paid it, but it broke her. It took her home, it took her life savings, took everything she owned. Under national health insurance, the bill wouldn't have been any higher, but it would have been balanced out over the whole economy, and I think that's what we ought to do.
McGovern, Democrat, for the people. The people are paying for this campaign with their hard-earned dollars. Send what you can to McGovern for President, Washington, D.C.
I'm a working man, and I work 40 hours a week just like everybody else. And it seems like if I get a Saturday, get a little overtime, let's say I get $70, $75. You know, exactly half of that overtime goes to taxes. I am really working for nothing.
You ever ask yourself where that tax dollar goes? We used to run the United States government on about $10 billion a year. We've spent $150 billion on Vietnam alone. We're spending $80 billion on the Pentagon every year. The President wants another $4 billion added on this year, beyond what we were spending last year on military operations. I think you ought to ask yourself where that tax dollar's going.
McGovern, Democrat, for the people. The people are paying for this campaign with their hard-earned dollars. Send what you can to McGovern for President, Washington, D.C.
The following program has been paid for by the McGovern for President Committee.
Senator George McGovern of South Dakota, candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination.
3 years ago, Mr. Nixon campaigned on the pledge that he had a secret plan to end the war. Whatever happened to that secret plan? Instead of taking us out of Vietnam, the President has taken us into Laos and Cambodia. Since Mr. Nixon's election, our planes have dropped on the little countries of Indochina 1.5 times the bomb tonnage of World War II. Since his election, 18,000 young Americans have died. Another 400 of our airmen are prisoners or missing in action. The administration has used these prisoners as a political issue when it knows that they will not come home until the President sets a date for ending military operations in Indochina. And all this time, we have paid higher taxes and higher prices because of the war. Mr. Nixon now announces that 139,000 American troops will remain in Indochina next spring. He tells us that he intends to keep some American troops there indefinitely. And all of this to prop up another corrupt regime in Saigon. Yet, no matter how long we stay, we cannot determine the political future of Indochina. I don't want any more Vietnams. I want a foreign policy based on our true national interest, not on obsolete Cold War politics. We need to pit our minds, our resources, and our young people against the real enemies of this country. I mean enemies like crime, narcotics, unemployment, run-down neighborhoods, discrimination, an unfair tax system, government that doesn't work. $4 billion. The cost of bombing Vietnam this year would build a good school or health clinic in 3,000 of our cities and still leave $1 billion to strengthen the income of hard-pressed family farmers. But most of all, we need to get back together. This means not only ending the war, but helping our Vietnam veterans with a more generous GI Bill. It also means that the next president should do as Abraham Lincoln did and grant a general amnesty to those young men who, for reasons of conscience, chose jail or exile rather than this war. I do not believe the war will end or the real work of this nation begin until there is a new American president. That's why I'm running for president. I need your help. Together, we can make a new start in this country.
Recently, President Nixon raised $5 million in a single night from big business and special interests. Senator McGovern's support can only come from ordinary citizens like you. To win his campaign, he needs your help now. Please send your dollars this evening to McGovern for President, Box 100, Washington, D.C. McGovern, a president you could trust.
Well, either way, it won't be a disaster. What am I looking for? I mean, so I'll vote for Nixon. Why rock the boat? I'm not crazy about it. Never was. I gotta decide, though. I gotta make up my mind. I don't know about McGovern. I don't have that much time. I can't keep people waiting. The fellas are voting Nixon. They expect me to vote for him, too. Me vote for Nixon. My father'd roll over in his grave. The fellas say they are. I don't know. Maybe they're not. Crime? I don't feel safe. Prices up. Got a gut feeling. Don't vote for Nixon. Why am I confused? Who am I measuring McGovern against? My gut feeling, McGovern. This hand voted for Kennedy. I mean, it's just possible. McGovern's straight. Maybe he can. That's the way.
They're paying people on welfare today for doing nothing. They're laughing at our society. Because we're all hard-working people, and we're getting laughed at for working every day. Why not have them go to work and clean up the dirty streets in our towns?
Well, I agree.
For that money.
I don't think that anybody ought to get a dime out of welfare who's capable of working.
Right.
And I think we ought to have a system that doesn't permit that. Richard Nixon goes around talking as though I'm some kind of a radical because I believe in guaranteed jobs for people that he's throwing out of work. But he has followed economic policies that have been a disaster for the working people of this country. He said he was going to give us 5 million new jobs. He put 2 million people out of work. He said he was going to cut the welfare rolls. He put 4 million people on welfare. That's not my idea of delivering on a campaign pledge. Now, I'm telling you, and I mean it, we're going to do whatever is necessary to provide a job for every able-bodied man and woman in this country who wants to work, and those who don't want to work shouldn't be paid anything in the way of public support.
Senator, could I ask you a question? What do you think about the people that are retired and on fixed income?
There are two problems they have. The retirement income is not as great as it should be.
Right.
We've got old people living on less than $100 a month. When you see these people trying to make a few dollars stretch over the grocery bill and pay the rent, take care of their medical bills, it almost breaks your heart. They can't do it. Now, one thing we all ought to be interested in, because we're all going to be old someday, is in seeing to it that those retirement benefits, whether it's under Social Security or some other plan, that they're generous enough so that our older people can have some measure of security and decency and dignity.
Protection of the Social Security and retirement benefits.
I'm for that. Nixon said it was inflationary when we tried to raise the retirement income of the older people. He doesn't think it's inflationary when he helps ITT, but it's inflationary when you help these old people, or when you do something for the schools.
Where does it end?
On the welfare system?
Not just on welfare. All the way around. The growing bureaucracy and the high administrative cost of government.
Well, I think it's a good point. We spend about $1.5 billion running the welfare program alone, just on the red tape. Now, one thing I want to do is end the whole welfare bureaucracy and run the whole thing through the Internal Revenue Service.
The working man around here is so disgusted with government. I mean, the taking away of individual freedoms, you know, such as there are figures cast around at 75 to 80%. Both white and blacks alike oppose busing, yet they're going ahead with it. What's your answer to that?
You may not like busing, I may not like it. That's not the issue. The question is whether you're going to have a court that rules on constitutional questions of that kind or whether everybody's going to be his own judge. The Supreme Court, and I didn't appoint Warren Burger as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Richard Nixon did. And he wrote the decision that a certain amount of busing was required as an instrument of improving the schools. Now, whether you like the decision or not, that's what the court has said. I wouldn't say I like this decision, I'm going to back the court here. I don't like this decision, I'm going to jerk the rug from under them. If we're going to run a democracy, we've got to respect the court. Because the day may come when you have a case that you'll want to appeal all the way through to the Supreme Court to protect your liberty. That's why we have a judicial system. That's why we have a trial by jury. You don't always agree with the decisions of the court, but you kill this court system and you'll kill liberty in this country.
McGovern, Democrat, for the people. The people are paying for this campaign with their hard-earned dollars. Send what you can to McGovern for President, Washington, D.C.
In our business, we hire a lot of young people, and we can live with the $1.60 wage, whereas at $2.20 it gets...
To the American small businessman, working a 60-hour week is often a luxury. It is a hard, frustrating, uphill battle just to keep alive. And he has a right to know what kind of man would lead his country.
I was out to Mitchell, South Dakota, and I understand you're from a very conservative background. How do you put this together with the accusations that you're a radical?
Well, I don't think I'm a radical. I think that the conservative origins that I come from tend to make me appreciate the first principles of the country, and I think we've departed from those principles. We started off in the Declaration of Independence with 3 affirmations. We said everyone was entitled to life, to liberty, and to the pursuit of happiness. And it seems to me we've been pursuing a course in recent years that moves directly contrary to those principles. That's why I've found the war in Vietnam so obnoxious, that it seems to me to be a contradiction of everything decent that this country stands for. I'm not talking about the commitment of the individual soldier, but the whole policy of massive aerial bombardment of primitive agricultural countries I find offensive to the ideals that I was taught in a religious home. I was a bomber pilot in World War II. It's not that I'm a pacifist, but I think we have to be very careful about using the enormous military power of this country trying to achieve our objective overseas. I think that any sense of justice would call on conservatives or liberals to address the inequities in our tax system. It's just not fair. Now, people say I'm radical in saying we ought to close the loopholes in the tax laws, but I just think it's justice and common sense. I don't think it's radical to say, for example, that everybody ought to have a job, even if the government has to come in as the employer of last resort. The greatest waste we now have in the United States are the 6 or 7 million people who are unemployed. And I'd find some way to get those people back to work, either by direct contracting with private industry to begin improving our cities and building up our environment, building better transit facilities and things of that kind, or where you couldn't do it by direct contract with industry, I would do it with public service employment, because I think every able-bodied person ought to be working. And I don't regard that as a radical doctrine. What part of the charge against me do you think justifies the label radical?
Well, I myself don't feel that you are a radical. I think that you're a humanitarian. I think that some of the things you are saying are consistent with the Christian belief. This would be my feeling, but I've heard this charge made several times.
Every leader throughout our history who has advocated change in the way things are at a given time has been called a radical. Unless you're willing to just drift with the status quo, somebody's going to call you a radical. They did that to Abraham Lincoln. They did it to Franklin Roosevelt. They did it to John Kennedy. These people that have stood for fundamental change in the country have all been branded as radicals. After they die, they become heroes. Somebody has said that a conservative is a worshiper of dead radicals.
McGovern, Democrat, for the people. The people are paying for this campaign with their hard-earned dollars. Send what you can to McGovern for President, Washington, D.C.
If our economy depends on a war, we're licked.
I agree. It doesn't, though. We'll do better in peacetime than we will in wartime if we invest the money that we save from the war with some common sense. You'll have more jobs for people. If you invest the money we're now blowing up over there in Vietnam on building the things that we need here at home, it'll actually create more jobs.
And another thing, Senator.
McGovern, Democrat, for the people.
Tax shelters benefit very high-income people at the expense of people in the middle. The people in this room are paying a heavier tax burden because we have too many loopholes in the law at the top. I don't mind paying a third of my income in federal taxes until I read where somebody who's making 10 times as much as I am paid nothing. And that's what infuriates a lot of these working people that I see in the factories and the shops around this country. They read reports where multimillionaires are paying at 5 or 6% rate, and they're paying at a 14 to 20% rate as working people. You really can't justify that.
McGovern, Democrat, for the people. The people are paying for this campaign with their hard-earned dollars. Send what you can to McGovern for President, Washington, D.C.
How come Congress has done nothing about it? Do you think you could get them to do something about it?
If you had a president who was really committed to the people, you could carry out a program of tax reform and tax justice that the Congress would go along with. The American people are willing to pay their taxes. What they object to is somebody else paying nothing at all, who's in a better position to pay. That's where we have this outcry against taxes.
McGovern, Democrat, for the people.
I think our unemployment situation is far and away the most serious economic problem before the country today.
Unemployment rate, I think you said 6.1%.
Yeah.
And you know as well as I do that that's really a false figure.
It is false. 6% is what the government gives as the official figure. But that doesn't include probably at least 1 million people who no longer even go to the employment office and list their names. They've given up. And it isn't just an accident that the president ordered the statisticians in the Bureau of Labor Statistics to quit briefing the press on what the unemployment situation is, because they don't want questions asked like the one you just asked. If we were doing the kind of things we ought to do here at home, building the housing and the transportation, the environmental programs, we'd have jobs for all of these people that are out of work.
McGovern, right from the start.
When Mr. Nixon became president, there were 2,700,000 unemployed Americans. Today, there are 4,700,000 unemployed. Since Mr. Nixon became president, the nation has lost $160 billion in national income through unemployment. Since Mr. Nixon became president, the nation has lost $42 billion in income taxes through unemployment. Since Mr. Nixon became president, 4 million people have gone onto welfare. In 1968, Mr. Nixon said, "What we need are not more millions on welfare rolls, but more millions on payrolls." Mr. Nixon has spoken in favor of work, but his actions have driven Americans by the tens of thousands into unemployment and onto welfare. McGovern, for the people.
Could I ask you a question? What do you think about the people that are retired and on fixed income?
When you see these people trying to make a few dollars stretch over the grocery bill, it almost breaks your heart. They can't do it. Now, one thing we all ought to be interested in is in seeing to it that those retirement benefits are generous enough so that our older people can have some measure of security and decency and dignity.
McGovern, Democrat, for the people.
Presidential television debates were not designed to serve a candidate for office. They were designed to serve the public. Television debates prevent a candidate from waging a campaign based on special interest appeals. Television debates give voters the opportunity to see the real man, not the synthetic product of public relations experts. And they contribute to 4 major objectives which are in the public interest: a bigger vote, better informed voters, lower campaign costs, and, in the end, a better president. The foregoing is a statement by Richard M. Nixon, before he became President of the United States. Since the statement is as true today as when he wrote it, why does Mr. Nixon refuse to debate Senator McGovern?
You know, thousands of Connecticut workers have lost their jobs under Nixon. Nixon policies have frozen workers' wages while prices keep rising. History shows that the presidents who understood the people, worked for the people, and helped the people, men like Roosevelt, Truman, and John Kennedy, were Democrats. Today, our country needs a democratic leadership of George McGovern and Sergeant Shriver. These men understand the need to create new jobs for everyone, to have a fair balance between wages and prices. I urge you to pull the second lever on November 7th, to put Democrats in the White House, the Congress, and the Connecticut State Legislature. You are voting for our country and yourself when you vote Democratic.
4 years ago, Richard Nixon said, "We are on the road to recovery from the disease of runaway prices." Since Mr. Nixon became president, the cost of whole wheat bread has gone from 31 cents to 45 cents. Since Mr. Nixon became president, the price of hamburger has gone from 58 cents to 89 cents. Since Mr. Nixon became president, the cost of frozen fish has gone from 69 cents to $1.29. Since Mr. Nixon became president, the cost of living has gone up 19%, and your wages have been frozen. So next time you're in the supermarket, ask yourself, can you afford 4 more years of Mr. Nixon?
On that issue of closing the tax loopholes, do you think you would have more influence than our previous chief executives?
The previous chief executive, who's in there right now, has moved in the other direction. He declared an accelerated depreciation allowance that put $4.5 billion into the hands of the corporations, and he did that at the same time that he was putting on wage controls. In other words, he said, we're going to freeze the income of people who work for a living, but we're going to give the corporations a $4.5 billion rake-off in lower taxes. Now, if you had a president who was working in the other direction on behalf of ordinary taxpayers rather than these big corporations, we could have a tax system that's fair.
McGovern, Democrat, for the people. The people are paying for this campaign with their hard-earned dollars. Send what you can to McGovern for President, Washington, D.C.
President Nixon has received $10 million in secret campaign contributions from men and interests whose names Mr. Nixon refuses to reveal to the American people. Who are these men? And what do they want? McGovern, for the people.
One of the reasons I'm disturbed about the president's $10 million secret election fund is that it indicates there's something there he's afraid to disclose. Well, what are they hiding? That I'm perfectly willing to publish the name of every dollar contributed to my campaign, and I don't see what the president is covering up. But it's that kind of thing that puts a kind of a damper on the moral tone of the whole nation.
McGovern, Democrat, for the people.
In the meantime, the people on the welfare, sure, in turn, they are receiving money there for doing nothing.
Yeah, but the way it works now, you're paying both for the guy on welfare and you're paying for the fat cats at the top that aren't paying their fair share of the tax load. Now, what I'm proposing is that we provide a guaranteed job for everybody that wants to work and require that as a condition of welfare, the person be unable to work.
McGovern, Democrat, for the people.
The people of this country are going to have to be more alert about where their tax dollars are going. Everybody here wants this country to have a strong military defense. Nobody's saying we ought to scrap the Defense Department, but we don't need to spend $80 or $82 billion a year to defend this country. The time has come to begin recognizing we've got some things to defend against here at home.
McGovern, Democrat, for the people.
My nephew was killed over in Vietnam about 2 years ago. We're going to go to Russia now and help develop their country. And the Chinese, they want Nixon to stay in power here yet. Why?
Personally, I think it was a good thing the president went to Peking. Right. I think it's a good thing we're trying to improve our relations with Russia. But why do we say that 15 million people in North Vietnam are a greater threat to the United States because they're communists than 800 million people in China or 300 million in Russia? This is the thing that doesn't make sense.
I voted for Nixon in '68. I never voted for a Republican before until he come along and says he's going to stop this war, which he didn't.
Well, do you know who you're going to vote for this year?
George
McGovern, Democrat, for the people. The people are paying for this campaign with their hard-earned dollars. Send what you can to McGovern for President, Washington, D.C.
You said that you would try to stop the war.
Absolutely.
Tell me, what is going to become of the prisoners of war over there?
That's the only way you're ever going to see them, is to end the war.
Right. But if you stop it before you bring them home, then what?
You never in history have got prisoners out while a war was on. This is where the president has tricked us. And that's why the wives of a lot of those prisoners are out campaigning for me, because they know they'll never see their husbands if we keep this war going. There's never been an exception to that in modern history. Don't let anybody fool you into thinking that we're bombing North Vietnam so they'll release the prisoners. They're never going to release the prisoners as long as they're bombed. They're not going to release them as long as we're backing General II. We can have General II or we can get our prisoners out, but we can't have both. And I think we've done enough for him.
McGovern, right from the start.
1/3 of my salary has been taken away from me. Now, if they raise the taxes any more than what they have, the majority of people cannot pay their taxes and they cannot endure the hardships that are put upon them.
Well, I agree with that. We cannot raise taxes anymore on low and middle income taxpayers. We have to provide high.
There are millions of people in America who wonder what happened to the money they have saved and the retirement they have earned. People who have found that what has happened in America during the past 4 years has shattered their hopes for a life free of suffering and loneliness.
Woman, she's 67 years old, and all she gets from the government on Social Security is $63 a month.
Every time in the history of this country we've gotten into a war, we've had a bad inflationary situation. Wars always raise the cost of living. They waste billions of dollars that we need here at home, and it has the effect of raising the price of everything that we buy. That's where most of your tax dollars are going today, either for the war or for preparation for war. Billions of dollars could be cut out of military spending. There's some people who are so foolish to think that anything that has a defense label on it is sacred. Now, it's not. There's a lot of waste and fat in that defense budget. And if we applied the same kind of standards there that we do to appropriations to help the old people in this country, we could save billions of dollars in just sheer waste.
I went to a drugstore to pick some medication for my paralyzed wife, and there was a man standing there waiting for a bus. So I went over and talked to him. I said, which way are you going? He said, I'm going down to, way down to Greenfield Avenue. I said, come on, I'll take you home. That man actually cried in my car. He said, I can't make it anymore. And every month, he has to spend $12.50 for medication. He said, I don't know what to do.
Maybe he cried because somebody showed a kind act towards him. I think a lot of older people are lonely. Ordinarily, he would have been left standing on that street corner alone. It's easy to walk by people who are old. Well, they need a lift. I don't find that old people ask very much. They've given their lives, they've given their health, they've reared their children, they've paid their taxes, they've built their homes, they've kept up the neighborhoods, the churches, and the schools. Then they come to a time when they aren't able to work anymore, when the illnesses come more often, and when there's more loneliness and less encouragement. That's the time when I think government ought to provide a helping hand. I got a letter from a lady last spring, and she was 82 years old. She has paid taxes all her life. She lives in a little one-bedroom house which she owns. She wants to keep it because she and her husband lived in that house for about 40 years before he died. But it costs her $560 a year in property taxes, and her income is only $1,700 a year. She was out painting the house herself. 82 years old, and she's up on a ladder painting that house herself. I would think any decent person, whether they're old, middle, or young, would want to do what we need to do to see that these older people can live out their later years with some happiness and some security. That's what I want to do.
McGovern, Democrat, for the people.
But if you wanted to give one message to the working people, what would it be?
Well, my message to the working people would be to look very carefully at the issues between Nixon and myself in 1972 in the way of jobs, in the way of tax reform, in the way of restoring peace to the world, because those are the issues that are going to decide the future of this country. Where do the two candidates stand on environmental issues? Where do they stand on job safety? Where do they stand on health care and education? And if people will look at those problems honestly, I think we're going to win this election in '72.
McGovern, Democrat, for the people. The people are paying for this campaign with their hard-earned dollars. Send what you can to McGovern for President, Washington, D.C. It was almost dawn in Miami when the final moment came. But the lateness of the hour did not dim the emotion in that hall. For the victory they celebrated was not his alone.
My nomination is all the more precious in that is the gift of the most open political process in all of our political history.
The reforms had worked, for in Miami that night were people from the entire length and breadth of their party. Some were professionals, Many were amateurs, but they all were Democrats, and they all shared the belief that this year, each of them would make a difference.
I'm a housewife and a mother and a dairy farmer. I have one son, 17, and he was very anxious to do the driving. And so he offered to take me down, but he also told me if I didn't vote correctly, I'd walk home, and his vote was for McGovern.
Yeah, I've been in politics since 1960, and I think that's a difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party to begin with. I think the Democratic Party is the party of the people, the ones who care.
There were only 3 from the delegation that had never been to a convention before. We were all new, and we didn't have a moment's free time. You know, the first night went 10 hours.
People feel as if there's no way they can influence what happens. And I always felt that way. And in fact, that's the really great thing about, I went to the National Democratic Convention, you know. A lot of people said, oh, you lost prime time by being up all night. Well, that to me was great. And every delegate that was there stayed there and stayed with it.
The state senators and the members of the House of Delegates and all of these new people really worked hard.
The everyday person in our section, they were making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and salami sandwiches right there on the convention floor because they didn't have the money to eat in the hotels and restaurants. It wasn't a convention to play. The Miami people, the hotel people, and the restaurant people were very unhappy because we didn't play.
We worked hard on the floor, and we had freedom of the floor to work in the way that we wanted to work.
Lots of people are able to participate, and because they're participating, then the politicians, or he in this case, will have to listen to what the people say. And he's going to respond to the people.
People were voting in their own conscience. I saw that myself. I saw democracy happening right there on the floor.
We all moved together. This was great. We worked as a team.
It was just fantastic. It was the first time I've ever seen anything that's supposed to not work.
This is the people's nomination, and next January, we will restore the government to the people of this country. Let the opposition collect their $10 million in secret money from the privileged few, and let us find 1 million ordinary Americans who will contribute $25 each to this campaign, a 1 million member club with members who will not expect special favors for themselves, but a better land for us all.
The contributions of 200,000 ordinary Americans had made him their nominee. He would need 1 million more to make him their president. The people are paying for this campaign with their hard-earned dollars. Send what you can to McGovern for president, Washington, D.C. McGovern, Democrat, for the people.
He's continuing the bombing, not to get our men out of prison, but to keep General Tu in power. And that's a price I'm not willing to pay. Let me just add one thing. One of the great problems that we've had in the leadership of this country is that we have had too many people that were unwilling to change their mind when they got new evidence. They were afraid they'd lose face, and so they wouldn't change. Now, I think we need a president who isn't afraid to say, I'm going to change my mind. I made a mistake. And sometimes you ought to be able to say to the people, this is not going to be popular, but this is what we're going to have to do to save our country. You have to make those hard decisions.
McGovern, Democrat, for the people. The people are paying for this campaign with their hard-earned dollars. Send what you can to McGovern for president, Washington, D.C.
Can you tell me why the price of food is going way up? My daughter has 5 children, and they're reduced to eating noodles and rice and trying to stretch the budget. And I thought through phase 1 and 2, the prices would be frozen, but they are not. They are still going up.
I don't like the present wage price formula. It's not working. It's loaded against the side of working people, and it's not protecting
The
consumers.
Secretary of Agriculture said we should eat fish, but fish is $1.79 a pound. That doesn't help very much.
The wage and price control program under Nixon is a very lopsided operation in which they've been fairly effective in holding down the income of working people and freezing the wages, but the price control part of it's been a disastrous failure, and you're reminded of that every time you go to a supermarket.
Most of us feel that our property taxes are awfully high, and we'd really like to know what you have in mind to provide some relief.
The ordinary family can hardly own their own home anymore, or their own business, or their own farm. I talked to a woman at Kenosha, Wisconsin during the primary election last spring. As I recall it, she was paying more than a third of her entire income to support the property tax on the little house that she lived in. She had an income of about $1,700 a year, and the property tax on her house was $570 a year.
If ever we get up enough for a down payment, I don't know if we could pay the property taxes. We'll be ready to retire.
The only way I can see to reduce that load is for the federal government to move in and pick up a heavier share of the services that the states and cities are now carrying. The great injustice in the tax laws are in these loopholes that permit some of the richest people to pay little or no taxes at all, and that's not right. That money is one source of money that you could use to take some of the pressure off the middle-income taxpayer.
I'm a working man, and I work 40 hours a week just like everybody else. And it seems like if I get a Saturday, get a little overtime, let's say I get $70, $75. You know, exactly half of that overtime goes to taxes. I am really working for nothing.
You ever ask yourself where that tax dollar goes? We used to run the United States government back in the days of Franklin Roosevelt on about $10 billion a year. We've spent $150 billion on Vietnam alone. We're spending $80 billion on the Pentagon every year. The president wants another $4 billion added on this year, beyond what we were spending last year on military operations. I think you ought to ask yourself where that tax dollar's going.
My nephew was killed over in Vietnam about 2 years ago. Yeah. Now I understand we're going to go to Russia now and help develop their country. And the Chinese are worried about you getting in. They don't want you to get in. They want Nixon to stay in power here yet. Why? If we're fighting communism, why should he stay in business?
Now, personally, I think it was a good thing the president went to Peking. Right. I think it's a good thing we're trying to improve our relations with Russia. But why do we say that 15 million people in North Vietnam are a greater threat to the United States because they're communists than 800 million people in China or 300 million in Russia? This is the thing that doesn't make sense.
I voted for Nixon in the 60s. I never voted for a Republican before until he come along and says he's going to stop this war, which he didn't. Now, all of a sudden, he's stopping it.
Well, do you know who you're going to vote for this year?
George McGovern!
McGovern, Democrat, for the people. The people are paying for this campaign with their hard-earned dollars. Send what you can to McGovern for President, Washington, D.C.
In 1968, candidate Richard Nixon said, "A Nixon administration can win the war against crime and violence. Since Mr. Nixon has been president, rape is up 22%. Since Mr. Nixon has been president, aggravated assault is up 25%. Since Mr. Nixon has been president, robbery is up 27%. Since Mr. Nixon has been president, theft is up 47%. When he came into office, the number of serious crimes reported each day in America was 10,000. Today, it is 17,000. In a nationwide radio address in 1968, Mr. Nixon said, "For my part, I will make this pledge. I will never promise what I cannot deliver."
One of the recent problems that we've had with presidency is its lack of communication with the people.
Well, I think instead of getting behind that big iron fence around the White House and talking to no one except your advisors, the White House ought to be an open place where exchanges can take place. There's nothing worse than an intellectual without a heart. It was that crowd that charted our course in Vietnam. It wasn't these hard hats out here on the job that get blamed for it. They didn't have anything to do with it. What is the credibility gap except a conclusion on the part of millions of Americans that these old voices in politics can't be trusted anymore? They just don't believe the government. And that's why I think it's going to take a new kind of leadership that's compassionate and just to restore some measure of public confidence.
McGovern, right from the start.
And whenever the war is over, then there'll be more layoffs and this type of stuff.
If we have to depend on war, we're in sad shape in this country. You know, that's really the argument that the communists make. They say our society won't work unless we have a war going on. Now, frankly, I don't believe that. At the end of World War II, which is the war I participated in, we had full employment after that war. And the reason is that we set about doing the things we needed to do that we couldn't do with the war on. Now, those problems are still here. We need new housing, new environmental protection programs, and if we stop the waste that's going on in this war, we can provide a job for every man and woman who wants to work. And I'm pledged to that.
McGovern, Democrat, for the people. The people are paying for this campaign with their hard-earned dollars. Send what you can to McGovern for President, Washington, D.C.
I think you have to deal, first of all, with the criminal. That's the law enforcement end. The other end is the research and treatment on the drug addict. Certainly this country is rich enough to deal with the drug addict. There are 300,000 people addicted to hard drugs. There are 2,000 known Vietnam veterans who became addicted while they were in Vietnam, who are now in New York, who cannot get treatment. These are 2,000 that want treatment, that have come seeking it. God only knows how many people are addicted who never show up at a clinic or at a doctor's office. But I think that's intolerable. We found those young men when we needed them to go to Vietnam. We ought to be able to find them now while they're crying for help.
McGovern, right from the start.
It just literally breaks my heart when I see some of these older people going through a grocery store trying to pick up some stale bread, trying to stretch that little paycheck when they need good, nutritious food. We ought to be able to provide a minimum income for every old person in this country so that they live out those last years with some dignity.
McGovern, for the people.
The price of everything you buy keeps going up and up, so you've got a lopsided system where they put a lid on wages, but no real controls on the prices that people buy. Secondly, they don't have any controls at all on corporate profits or on interest rates. Why single out the guy who lives on wages for an income and say to the man who makes his income on stocks and dividends and interest rates and corporate profits that there's no control on him. He's free to make all the money he wants. I don't think that's fair.
The working man will be asleep when it comes to the polls, and we're going to teach him differently.
Yeah, that's right.
McGovern, Democrat, for the people. The people are paying for this campaign with their hard-earned dollars. Send what you can to McGovern for President, Washington, D.C.
as a retired person, my funds are limited, and my Social Security isn't a terrible, a lot of amount of money, you know. But I did support McGovern as much as I could, $5 now, $10 one time, and as an older person, you get not so interested in things. You're more interested in ideas. You can go without a dress, and you could wear the things that you've had for some time, and send $5 to someone that you think will do something for our country.
In your paper this Sunday will be a letter and envelope from George McGovern asking you to send what you can.
With all the money behind a lot of the people in our government and the big corporations, are we really to believe that someone is going to close loopholes to actually help me, the average
I've
citizen?
run my campaign without making concessions to these big interests. I don't owe them anything. I've financed this campaign out of small contributions, and on that basis, I can face up to these big interests more readily than someone who is beholden to them because of big campaign support. If a president goes into that White House a free man, I don't have to worry about offending General Motors or ITT. ITT didn't give me $400,000.
McGovern, right from the start.
4 years ago, Mr. Nixon said, "I pledged in my campaign to end this war. If I fail to do so, I expect the American people to hold me accountable for my failure." During the Nixon years, more than 6 million Indo-Chinese have been killed, wounded, or made homeless. During the Nixon years, Americans have dropped 3,700,000 tons of bombs. During the Nixon years, 20,000 Americans have been killed, over 100,000 wounded, and 500 captured or missing. During the Nixon years, the Vietnam War has cost American taxpayers $62 billion. 4 years ago, Mr. Nixon said, "Those who have had a chance for 4 years and could not produce peace should not be given another chance."
Now we have blind, paralytics, wheelchairs, crutches.
Some kind of a facility whereby we wouldn't sit helpless by and watch our neighbors die.
They raise our rent, our food goes up, and we're back in the same position we were.
We're just being forgotten.
You know, someday somebody's going to write the history of these times, and I think it's going to be a pretty sad chapter when they write the story on the way we've treated our older people. And there isn't anything that we ought to want for ourselves and for our older people any more than that those later years can be years of confidence and some degree of security and decency. And I'm going to do everything I can to see that older people are treated decently. Well, I think we're going to make it. I hope you'll help me.
We all will.
McGovern, right from the start.
In his speech to the Republican convention, Mr. Nixon spoke of Tanya, a Russian child whose family died in the siege of Leningrad. He quoted the final line in her diary, "All are dead, only Tanya is left." "Let us think of Tanya," said Mr. Nixon, "and all the other Tanyas everywhere, as we proudly meet our responsibility for leadership." Since Mr. Nixon became president, 165,000 South Vietnamese civilians, men, women, and children, our allies, people we are fighting to save, have been killed by American bombs. In a recent month, a quarter of the wounded civilians in South Vietnam were children under 12. As we vote November 7th, let us think of Tanya and all the other defenseless children of this world.
You're working 11, you're working 10 hours.
I've been walking through these factories and mills and mines now for 15 months, and I frankly don't know how people stand it. For example, in one of the steel plants, I'm told the guys that walk on top of those coke ovens are walking on material that's 180 degrees hot. They're lifting lids where the temperature's 450 degrees hot, and that the incidence of cancer and heart disease and everything else is much higher there. Do you have conditions like that? And
Senator, one incident. I'd like to say something. I install springs. Compress them with the machine. This man does the same thing on the opposite side of the line. Now, when those springs seat, they pop. And I figure I'm going to be deaf if I keep on that job for 5 years.
Is that right?
The only reason it is loud is because those parts, those springs, are oversized. They're defective. This could be corrected, and they have never done it.
And the right spring, they've got it sensed.
So they're willing for an employee to go deaf?
This man is a number, and this man is a number. And if we raise too much hell, we won't be there any longer.
Their whole purpose is to frighten him, me, you, scare everybody to work harder. When you work harder, you're still another number. If they throw him out because he didn't work harder, that scares me and you, so we work harder and do his job.
The solder that they have, right on the label, it reads that it is poisonous. Do you know how long it's taken us to get a blower system, which we still haven't got, to protect these men? We still haven't got it. And in the meantime, this man is breathing this poison into his lungs.
15,000 people killed in this country on the job. 15,000. That's as many as we lost in Vietnam in the worst year of the war. 9 million people injured in factories and mills and mines in this country. Some of them permanently disabled. And in some states, if you're disabled for life after working for 20 years, the compensation is so low that you'd be better off never having worked and dumping your family on the welfare rolls. And that's the kind of thing we've got to correct.
Senator, assembly line workers are the hardest workers in the world and is the most dehumanizing condition. They send you to school. Now, I'm only 23 years old, but when I went to high school, I had a good education. I had the option of taking high mathematics, high sciences, physics, geometry, and all the way up. And then I come out of the service, and I go into a plant here to get a job. Not with the income that would make me get ahead in life, but just with the exact same amount of income that could make me get by, have children, and buy a color TV every 5 years, and breed new assembly line workers. This kind of act, or whatever you want to call it, is dehumanizing for a person.
It's the same kind of dissatisfaction you've just expressed. It seems to me that what most people want who are capable to work is a good job. They want a job that doesn't turn them into a machine, turn them into an animal, that doesn't demean them as human beings. Secondly, they want a neighborhood that's halfway decent and pleasant. They don't want it strewn with garbage. They don't want drug addicts. They don't want crime to run rampant. Thirdly, they want to be sure that if they get sick, they're going to be able to pay the bills. And that means some kind of comprehensive health insurance. And the fourth thing people are concerned about is their old age. They want to know when they reach that time in life that they're going to be taken care of. And that's why I think we have to improve these retirement benefits and provide so that we can look forward to that time in our lives with some confidence, some sense of security, because we're all going to be old someday.
McGovern, right from the start.
Politician after politician, candidate after candidate comes forth and says, before they get in, this is what we're going to aim at, and nobody's ever delivered. I think that we've been duped by phonies and phoniness, and we're sick and tired of it.
You know, politics is my profession, and I'm embarrassed when it doesn't work. It hurts me when I see people in government betraying their public trust, just like you'd be embarrassed if somebody in your plant laid down on the job. I want to say to everybody in this room that while I don't expect you to agree with everything I say, you're going to know that when I say something, it's what I honestly believe. There'll never be a time when I'm sneaking around advocating something in secret behind closed doors that I'm ashamed to defend in public.
McGovern, for the people. The people are paying for this campaign with their hard-earned dollars. Send what you can to McGovern for President, Washington, D.C.
And I've read editorials that leaders thus far have not been behind you.
I think I can win this nomination. I think I can defeat Nixon and do it with the support of rank and file, whether we get the leaders or not. When you walk in that polling place and shut the door or pull the curtain, you're in there all alone. And that's why the commentators and the prophets are all proved wrong, because people are voting their individual consciences.
McGovern, right from the start.
Corporations such as IT&T.
These big corporations, through their directors, have made substantial political contributions, and they have political whack because of that.
What's going to stop who's ever running things to continue doing these things that are going on?
It depends a lot on what kind of president you have. We haven't got any contributions we're ashamed of. I mean, nobody's got a hook on me.
McGovern, right from the start.
We have a plant here that builds typewriter parts. Now this large manufacturer of typewriters has put a plant in Mexico, and they're hiring women for $3 a day, $15 a week, turning out the same parts that our American people are being laid off here in Menominee Falls.
Incredible as it sounds, they get a tax break that's more favorable to them investing overseas than they do investing here at home. We need to encourage surplus capital to invest here. I think this one of the big prices we've paid for this $80 billion defense establishment of ours is that we're funneling our best research and development brains into making sure we have the best tanks and the best missiles and the best aircraft carriers. Meanwhile, the Japanese, who only spend 1% of their gross national product on national defense, are investing their best brains in developing new industrial products that are very competitive. That's another reason to cut back on the numbers of people and resources we're funneling into the Pentagon and begin even subsidizing development of research and new techniques and new plants and new ways of production so that we can get back into competition with the Germans and the Japanese.
And this is in no way fair. Talk fair, well, business, they say, well, business isn't fair. You're supposed to take care of yourself. Where is something going to happen to our particular type of a business? And I believe you have a lot of small businessmen who are holding this all in and not bringing it out. The conglomerate is the one that's going to take over.
There has been a steady concentration of more and more economic power in the hands of fewer and fewer conglomerates. That's really what the ITT case was all about. You had a clear case developed in the antitrust division of the Department of Justice. And yet, because of various political pressures, that merger was allowed to go through, and every day, smaller, moderate, independent-sized businesses are being gobbled up by the conglomerates. So I think what is needed is a new commitment and maybe a louder outcry demanding that antitrust actions be enforced and that the independent businessman be protected. That's really the purpose of antitrust legislation.
You talk about tax loopholes. Can you specify what some of those loopholes are?
Well, I certainly think we ought to repeal those accelerated depreciation increases that were added last year. You really can't justify that. That's really a bonanza. Also, on the oil depletion and mineral depletion allowances, I think we've carried that too far. Some of the other tax shelters benefit very high-income people at the expense of people in the middle. And I really think that the people in this room are probably paying a heavier tax burden because we have too many loopholes in the law at the top. I paid 1/3 of my income in taxes last year. I'm not complaining about it. I published it so that people would know where my income derived from and also how I spent it. And I don't mind paying 1/3 of my income in federal taxes until I read where somebody who's making 10 times as much as I am paid nothing. And that's what infuriates a lot of these working people that I see in the factories and the shops around this country. They read reports where multimillionaires are paying at 5 or 6% rate, And they're paying at a 14 to 20% rate as working people. And that's what disturbs a lot of people.
Senator, is that what's called fuzzy on economics?
It may be, but it's what I believe.
McGovern, Democrat, for the people. The people are paying for this campaign with their hard-earned dollars. Send what you can to McGovern for President, Washington, D.C.
And I've got 3 sons, and I'm thinking about another home. And so one of my main gripes is taxes. I don't think I've finished from last year yet. I'm still paying. And I told my wife, I said, maybe if I can get some of the other big boys to pay their equal share of taxes, then I wouldn't feel so bad. If you sit around and wait, nobody's going to do nothing. Somebody's going to have to stand up for George McGovern. And 1 million people gave $5 apiece, that'd be $5 million more. I've given a small amount of money to the McGovern campaign. My wife said, are you going to make this up? I said, sure. I said, let's get him elected, and I think we'll all make it up.
In your paper this Sunday will be a letter and envelope from George McGovern asking you to send what you can.
Alfred C. Baldwin, a former FBI agent, has stated this. He was hired by James McCord, security chief for both the Republican National Committee and the Nixon Campaign Committee. Mr. Baldwin was assigned to listen illegally to over 200 private telephone conversations, calls made by Democratic Chairman Lawrence O'Brien and others from tapped telephones in Democratic headquarters at the Watergate. He sent reports on these conversations to William E. Timmons, Assistant to President Nixon for Congressional Relations at the White House. In 1968, Mr. Nixon said, "The President's chief function is to lead, not to oversee every detail, but to put the right people in charge, provide them with basic guidance, and let them do the job." The question is, do we want the system to continue to work this way for the next 4 years?